Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders, and welcome to your go-to place for information and inspiration to help you be even more effective. I'm your host, Sarah Olivieri, and my special guest for this episode is Rachel Burr, who is an executive coach and leadership consultant for leaders like you, as well as their teams. She has over 20 years of corporate and consulting experience in leadership, coaching, people development, learning, and organizational development. She's worked with leaders and teams from around the world, and she has master's degrees in organization development and clinical psychology. She partners with leaders to mine the untapped potential in people. And today we're going to hopefully be learning some of her top insights and tips for you. Welcome, Rachel. Before we dive into nonprofit leadership things, would you just share something about yourself personal to round you out as a whole person for our audience?
Absolutely, Sarah. First, thank you for having me. I love this question. I was thinking about it. I think one of the most interesting things that's happened to me, especially in my adult life, is that my husband is French. So I have French citizenship. And when I first met his family, I didn't speak any French. I took 4 years of Spanish in high school. So that was lovely. And so I've really appreciated how difficult communication can be because I'm not used to being in rooms where I can't communicate with people. And it feeds into my leadership work as well, because I know leaders who have trouble communicating, not necessarily a language barrier, but it gives me a lot more empathy, the empathy for them and how difficult and challenging it can be.
I love that personal fact. And there's nothing like struggling in a foreign language to make you feel like you really have lost your intelligence. But I think it's yeah. It's such a good leadership point to start off with. I often share with my clients or people I work with, like, in general, just assume that the majority of what you're trying to communicate is not actually going across. And it's only with great intention and care and effort that we manage to communicate successfully. And I find people who are very frustrated with people don't understand me, they're assuming that people are going to understand them. And if you just assume that people don't understand you, that you're always speaking a foreign language, you will be very happy and pleased at the number of people who do manage to understand you.
I love that. I love it.
So I want to ask you, what are some of the things that you have seen in your career that leaders struggle with most?
I think we've actually hit on a pretty good one. And I would say one of the things that comes up a lot with communication is people forget that listening is a critical part of communication. They focus on the words that they're using. And we both know that most communication isn't words anyway. It's body language, it's facial expressions. And so much, even more than obviously words, is listening. And I find that leaders they struggle with that.
Yeah, I love that I don't love that for leaders, but I love that as a point. You know, listening is really important. And part of that, I think that you're alluding to, right? Body language, right? I like the phrase, read the room, like knowing, looking as well as listening. That's great. So I know one of the things you like to bring to your work is humor. Tell me how you came to that and what does that look like?
I'm not even sure I came to it. I was pretty much born with it. So I think humor, let me back up, because there was a time in my career where I didn't feel comfortable bringing humor at all, because I had this idea, and I talk with my leaders a lot, that leadership is not a cookie cutter. It's not something you try to push yourself into, but that's what I was doing. I was trying to make myself fit, and I felt humor it wasn't serious. It didn't make me appear like confident and really deserving a seat at the table. a number of things happened which are too long for our podcast. But one day I realized that actually humor is so much about who I am, and bringing that authenticity can really lighten the mood. And I will say, humor used appropriately, right? It lightens the mood. And I also feel that humor is a great doorway for vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
That, if you're sitting, obviously you're going to a big, comedian kind of that kind of venue, that's not the same thing. But being with someone in a room, but to be able to laugh, to be able to laugh at myself, to be able to laugh at the situation, it just kind of puts people at ease and it opens them up. I think anyway, I feel like it's a much safer space.
Yeah, that is really true, and the authenticity piece, is key. I think
Yeah.
anytime you had me reflecting on my own journey, I wouldn't even just say as a leader, but as in confidence, right? The
Mhm.
more I experienced, the more I became confident, the more I've been comfortable just kind of sitting back and being like, I don't know. We'll figure it out, right? As like a
Yeah.
sales pitch, like,
Mhm.
"Oh man, that sounds hard." Like, what are we gonna do? And leaning into those moments of uncertainty or those moments when humor needs to come into play. And the vulnerability piece, I wanna just dive there for actually, coincidentally, was having a similar conversation earlier today about the power of comedy, humor, and vulnerability, and I was recounting a story that I'll keep very, very short here, but this year, I was interviewed by Sacha Baron Cohen's Ollie G character about
Oh,
diversity,
wow.
equity, and inclusion. And I didn't know what was about to happen until I was, like, in the room getting mic'd up. I thought I was participating in a more typical documentary about diversity, equity, inclusion, but I had
Huh.
this moment where I had to make a quick judgment call, like, "Am I really gonna go through with this?" And I very quickly answered to myself, yes, because even though this is kind of like challenging to hold a real conversation about DEI with a very ridiculous and fun character, but I ultimately believe that humor and satire is an amazing way to get right down to like the meat of, racism and cultural appropriation and like right into the heart of a conversation that typically would have people feeling uncomfortable. But in this kind of
Mhm.
very humorous dynamic, it was like, all right, we're going straight to the core. So
I am super impressed by that.
thank you. I hope everyone has grace from me with whatever they end up putting out there in the world. I still don't know exactly what's going to come of it, but it is what it is. And I went for it and I did my best to have a good time and be real about an important
Yeah,
topic.
I love that.
We've kind of I want to step back and kind of re-ask you, what does it look like, in your coaching and consulting work to bring humor to the table?
It looks different depending on the person. I always bring my authentic self, but to your point, reading the room, understanding the space as a collaboration between myself and my client. And obviously the things we're talking about, there's a balance. There are times to bring humor and there are times to be serious. And it's that yin and yang. And a lot of the places I bring humor are in metaphor. I think in metaphors, I find it's a great way to communicate because what I feel happens, neuroscience may say differently, but my experience is that when we're speaking words just as themselves, it's a very linear kind of process. Our brain has a very small working memory. And when we talk about kind of chunking information, people often refer to phone numbers. So, for example, like, an area code, we chunk information. So it's easier to take in more. Historically, human beings have been storytellers. And I think what happens with metaphor and story is that it taps into a very old ability that we have And by doing that, it really helps us step into an idea that maybe if you tell me something that I can't relate to, it just, I'm not going to resonate. It might bounce off of me. But somehow when we use metaphor, we can really connect. We may connect differently, but we connect with it in a way that can be much more profound and effective. And I find that sometimes the most humorous metaphors that it gets people laughing. And I think that vulnerability, it helps them pull that in. And especially if it's one of those things where the metaphor itself is silly. And then, and even if this, to your point, taking a very serious topic the way you did, and I would love to see that. Really. So you can take a very serious piece and then you take a funny metaphor and it's not making fun of them in the serious space that they're in. The metaphor is what's funny. And I think that balance really helps open up the dialogue.
Yeah, that's really true. So we touched on communication. What are some of the other things that you see leaders struggling with in your coaching practice?
One of the things, and this is just top of mind recently, I see a lot of times is as leaders start to step into broader roles in an organization, it becomes much more complex and more ambiguous. And they come from a place where either they've been a fantastic single individual contributor, right? Or maybe they've been a manager of individual contributors. And then they're starting to step into leaders of managers and then leaders of leaders. And before, even though vision and strategy, should be not just cascaded down, as they say, but kind of interpreted down as we talk about from layer to layer, depending on the work. Leaders at some levels are used to having someone kind of, communicate the vision to them. Then they step into a role where, no, now it's your turn. You have to create the vision. You're the one that has to cut through the gray and clarify things. And sometimes they struggle to clarify because they're waiting for someone else to clarify. Not that someone else shouldn't be helping with that, but as the leader, they have to step up and say, this isn't clear. How am I going to clarify this for my team? And then the ambiguity and stepping into a place that they're not comfortable with, it's so easy to just stay in the mindset of where I've been and where I've been successful. So the idea of actually promoting yourself in your head, you've been promoted on the org chart. Other people may see you in a new role. Do you see you in a new role? And what does that mean for you? And getting comfortable with being uncomfortable until you gain skills, talents, mastery. There's a long space in there where you just have to be willing to learn and open yourself up to opportunities.
I love that. And I love you said, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think that's, as people reach higher levels of leadership, there's you're comfortable because you're confident, and then you're comfortable or you're confident, you're comfortable because you know it, you're an expert.
Mhm.
But there is that
Yep.
level of leadership often at the
Yeah.
top where you're never going to be an expert in everything, and you have to get comfortable and confident being not knowing, not being an expert, and still
Yeah.
show up
Mhm.
confidently
Oh,
because that's often what people need from a leader.
well, and I think, oh my gosh, there's so much there to unpack. It's so good. So I think a couple of things is to your point, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is that happens in so many places in life. And as a leader, that vulnerability, being able to say to yourself and to others, like, I don't know, but to say it confidently as though because it's not a bad thing. It's about, this is why we need each other. I don't know. And then the listening part comes in, which is it's really good. And the other thing that happens, and I'm not surprised anymore. I was surprised early on in my career that I thought when leaders got to, a really high level, VP, EVP, CEO, any of the C-suite, that confidence just comes naturally, that they've in their minds, they're confident, they know where they are. And it initially surprised me at how much imposter syndrome continues to be there for them. And yet that is something that they are not wanting to recognize and step into, which I think is why coaching is so great, because they get to have this safe space. And I tell them, look, you get to bounce off the walls in here. Nothing's going outside this room. So they'll open up and be able to work through that in a different way, in a way that they really can't in the organization, and a lot of times shouldn't, because the people around them do need to feel confident. They are following you into your vision, into uncertainty. And yes, you need to work this out, for yourself. And it's not your people's job for you to work it out with them. So there's so many good things. And to your point about leaders being really good individuals, so often we take rock stars and we promote them into leadership roles, but that's not what makes somebody a good leader. And sometimes it's the antithesis of what makes someone a good leader. So it's just, this is a perfect example of the messy gooiness that has to be unpacked to help leaders really step into their authentic selves and be successful.
Yeah, I think that's, so key. To be a great leader, it's kind of like to be a great teacher, right?
Oh,
Just
yeah.
because you're an expert in a subject does not mean you're a great teacher. And a great teacher can teach just about anything, even if they know almost nothing about it, because their skill set, and I think teachers and leaders have a lot of crossover, is about seeing how people are reacting, dishing up, the kinds of resources they might need, encouraging people, championing them. So, yeah, there's so much to becoming a leader. And I think that, I want to step into this space of people get promoted who aren't ready to be leaders because they're promoting people into leadership positions for probably the wrong reason. So what would you say to the leaders out there who are thinking about promoting people on their team into leadership positions? What should they really be looking for as they do this?
Well, I think there's what they should be looking for and what the role requires, and what it takes to be a leader in that role. I think a lot of times people don't know what they should be looking for as leadership qualities. And I think if you're looking to promote someone, first for yourself, getting clear about what are the leadership qualities you want to see that will help someone be successful in this role. Because if you're not clear on what that takes, then how can the other person be clear? I also think it's important to think, well, I can't promote them because they're not ready. Well, okay, how are they not ready? Is it something where they just fundamentally, there's a lot of skills, knowledge, et cetera, that is insurmountable at this point, or is way too big of a stretch? Or is it something where, yes, this is a stretch, because promotions should be a stretch. If I already know how to do this job and I'm not in that job, then you've waited too long.
Yeah.
And that's a good way to lose people.
Right? They're now underpaid,
They're now
underappreciated.
underpaid, underemployed, underappreciated. The other thing is too, what you have in place to help this person step in. A lot of folks that I work with say, well, the person needs to, famous US saying, right? It's like pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And yes, we have to put in the work. Do we have to dig in and be willing to learn? Absolutely. Without any structure or any idea of how that's done or what needs to be done, you're not setting that person up for success. And way too many organizations, they don't do a good job of developing their leaders. And I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just, there's not a good understanding of what those skills are and a way to measure them. I'm air quoting for those who are just listening. Um, because we're so focused on what's quantifiable, whether those are metrics or KPIs or revenue or anything. And a lot of this just is not quantifiable. It's more, when I see it happening, I recognize it. And that's pretty hard to teach.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. You're reminding me of a book. I'm curious if you've read it. It's Keegan and Leahy's developmentally. What's it called? Um, deliberately developmental organizations, I think. They should have given it a
Ooh.
clearer name. But they have this curve in there. It was developed, by a group of psychologists, and it kind of describes and it has ways to
Mm.
understand where people are at in this
Mhm.
journey of at the stages. I'll have to look it up again, but the stages are kind of like very much like you talked about where, and they have to do with your comfort with uncertainty, right? Are you just like, basically ready to take commands and do the tasks? Are you ready to like lead some other people in something you're confident with? Or are you at the, getting to the kind of the third stage? I think it's 3 stages is about really being uncomfortable with uncertainty and being able to show up as a confident leader type in uncertainty. Maybe I'll do a solo episode on that book if I pull it out and
Absolutely.
dust it off. But the way you're talking about this really reminds me of that book and some interesting companies who have kind of built in pathways to
Yeah.
development in really unique ways. Because there are, surprisingly, they tend to be in the for-profit sector, but some folks who are doing really innovative things around
Yeah.
leadership. Um,
Yes.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So I want to ask you about how do you deal with bridging that gap, right? So let's say we've got leaders out there right now. They're in that new position, or maybe it's not so new to them. They're not feeling so confident. And I say not so new, right? Because sometimes people are like, yeah, like I'm ready for this. And then maybe like the board starts, or there's maybe a board member, 2 board members
Yeah.
starts like kind of eroding their trust and confidence. So I think it's not always just linear, right? Our confidence.
Yeah.
How do you find are some of the exercises or questions they can ask themselves to help grow?
I think, first of all, understanding where they are right now. And it's important because just because you're in the same role as someone else does not, because you're not the same person, you're not the same leader. So getting a sense of where you are as a leader today. And, there's a lot of 360s out there. There's different approaches, and it depends as a leader on the type of 360 that you might want to take.
Mhm.
Because again, it's not a cookie cutter. It's more about one, figuring out, well, a couple of things. One, what is required for this role? And from who you are at your authentic core, how do you bring that to this role to be successful? And then with the 360 understanding, what am I already doing really well? What are things that are areas I can develop that would be, really helpful? And then what are weaknesses that I have?
Mhm.
And I distinguish those a lot of times because I had an HR VP one time tell me where I was talking about opportunities. And he said, well, that's just a nice way to say weaknesses. And I said, well, I see it differently. I see I see opportunities as in this position with the right training, the right knowledge, the right opportunities, I could develop the skills to be successful. The alternative is the fact that if I showed up to a recruiting event for the WNBA, for the Women's Basketball Association tomorrow and said, I would like to be a basketball player. I can't jump. I'm too short. Like all of these things. It's like that is a weakness. And so it's really important to understand the difference because we can spend so much time trying to overcome a weakness that really should just be mitigated
Yeah.
or somehow figured out. There's other people in your organization that's probably a strength. So, and focusing on what are my strengths? How do I lean into those? Where do I need to develop? So understanding where I am now and then focusing on maybe 2 to 3 things, not everything. We're not boiling the ocean, and then put together a plan. Okay, what does that look like? And how do I develop a plan for me that will help me move forward?
Yeah. I love that focus you're bringing to it and that acknowledgement, right? Like sometimes we have not everything. Someone said this on a coaching call that I was involved with. I was just listening in. But they're like, not everything can be a mindset issue. And,
Yes.
and I was thinking about that, talking about like sometimes we have like weaknesses or challenges that we just need to like bypass. We don't need to become good at them. And I had an experience today where someone was telling me, that they know a couple people for like posting on social media, like they can write the posts and they can get it all together, but to actually post it, like they run into a real mindset challenge. And I have the same problem, right? Because I'll overthink it or whatever. My
Mhm.
solution is not to like pound it in until I, publish those things. I just use a scheduling tool. Or if I'm not doing that, I have
Mhm.
my assistant use the said scheduling tool, right?
Yeah.
It's not important for me to get good at pressing publish because I don't have to do it actually. And then
Yeah.
we can just eliminate that whole weakness completely. And it won't
Yeah.
come up. And that is so much more cost effective and time effective
Oh,
and
yeah.
energy effective. Like we only have so much energy to do our jobs. And kind of coming back to humor, I think one of the great things about humor is it can bring more energy to us.
Oh, yes.
But, we
Absolutely.
can get good at things that we don't love and that they're still draining, right? And I think often if
Yes.
we can focus on things that are energizing, we can get so much
Yes.
more
Oh, so much
completed
more.
with ourselves and our teams.
Well,
All
and I
right.
think,
Yeah.
can I build on that for just a second?
Yeah,
Because I
please.
think other piece that's really important about that, when you're talking about having your assistant help you, et cetera, a lot of people, especially when they have small budgets, they think, oh, but if I do this all myself, then I'll save money. And what's important is
Mhm.
really to look at the opportunity cost. For
Yeah.
example, if you're in a leadership role and you're down to your point, pushing a button on social media, when you could hire someone it would be a great fit for their talents and it would not cost you because if you think about what's my salary per hour, because people think, oh, it's just my time. Really? Well, how much is your time worth? And if you're, at a much higher level and instead you could be out generating revenue. You could be going out and networking with, donors or people who are wanting to come in and support you. The person that you've hired to push the button, that's not where their strengths are. That's not where, it's really important for people to realize the opportunity cost that when you're
Yeah.
spending time doing things that other people could be doing, you are losing out on all of the opportunity and the benefits for the things that only you can do.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, so it's not like, oh, how much time is it taking me to push the button? Like, what didn't I do while I was pushing that
Mhm.
button, right? Did I not
Yes.
respond to that last email? Did I not make that phone call? Did I feel too tired to have lunch with somebody who was a major connection? Yeah,
Mhm.
that's really, really important. And I think going back, when you're talking about kind of the value and power of coaching for people entering a new leadership position. I'm a huge fan. Like when I tell my clients, like, if you're going to bring in a new leader, or especially if it's
Mhm.
a new leader and starting a new department, you pair that with coaching
Yeah.
every single time. And the reason for that, the why I give that advice is the same. It's the opportunity cost. Because do you want that leader taking a year to acclimate, or do you want them taking like 3 months or so before you
Yeah.
start getting all the good leadership juices? Because there's a ton of missed opportunities
Oh,
while
yeah.
they're ramping up to their new position. I'm so glad you brought that up. Opportunity cost is huge. I think it's one of the main things that at least executives should be thinking about. Like, where are we
Mhm.
missing out on opportunities and how can we reallocate resources so that we could be taking advantage of them? And I totally agree. They are not weaknesses. Thinking about opportunities is really important. And I just started using another word. There's a famous, it's called the Dan Sullivan question. And he commonly he uses the word dangers instead of weaknesses, but he
Mm.
recommended a couple other words, one of which I found I really liked was worries. What
Worry.
worries do you need to overcome? And I think sometimes where I liked the word worry because sometimes there's like that gut instinct, right? We don't really have a
Mhm.
hard proof, oh, this is definitely an opportunity or this is definitely a risk, but we have that
Mhm.
gut worry, and that is
Yeah.
important too. What are any final words of advice you would have for them as leaders in growing in their positions? And also, what kinds of leaders should reach out to you, and what's the best way to get in touch with
I love that. I find a lot of times, and you work with nonprofits far more often than I probably do. But one of the things I notice for leaders in nonprofits is they are so driven by purpose. They are so driven by the mission and what they're giving to other people and what they're bringing to the world. And that's fabulous. And what I often see is because they're so busy taking care of others, taking care of the world, they don't take care of themselves and they run themselves ragged. They think they have to be perfect because their mission and vision are so important that if they're not perfect, that won't be achieved. And I can understand how, just from a heart and soul perspective, that absolutely is true. And going back to the opportunity cost piece, if you completely deplete yourself and run yourself ragged, you will not show up as your best authentic self. You will be wasting opportunity because you won't be able to really bring your full talent, your full energy, all your ideas. I think it's too easy for us to take ourselves for granted. So finding a way to make sure you're putting on your oxygen mask first in order to best serve your organization and your team, that is critical.
I love that. And who should get in touch with you, and what's the best way to do that?
Leaders that are coming into new roles, that are really coming into an expanded position, ambiguity, complexity, gray. I'm really good with that. The other leaders I get that I really love working with a lot of times are leaders who don't think they need coaching. They think they're good or they're not really open to experiencing that. And they have turned into some of my favorite clients because those are people, they want to be good leaders. They want to do a good job. And they're either the imposter syndrome gremlins are getting to them, or there's just people around them for best intentions. They're not communicating a lot of that with them. We tend to edit. We tend to censor ourselves as people get into positions of authority. We love in the US to think that our hierarchies are flat. They are not. And nor should they be at some point. Someone has to make a decision. So I love those leaders because I always say, I will tell you the truth. I will tell you my version of the truth. I'm not saying I'm always right, but that has the opportunity that maybe other people have concerns about their position in terms of your authority. I've got nothing to lose. I'm here for you, and we're going to talk about it. And if you don't agree with me, great. Tell me, we put it on the table. So leaders who really need coaching, but a lot of times don't think they do. Some of my favorite clients.
I love that. Well, we'll have all your information and links in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here. It has been such a pleasure. And thank you out there for listening and all that you do to make our communities better. In addition to this podcast, I also offer you a weekly newsletter, which is not so much a newsletter and more a quick tip around a specific topic so that it is bite-sized and easy to consume. If you would like to receive that, you can go to inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. Also, a small request, if you can, leave a review wherever you listen to this podcast, as it helps the podcast get found by other leaders who might find it helpful. Thank you again. Take care of yourself. Until next time, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.